Chapter 7, Parts 1, 2, and 3, Rule Utilitarianism. On the campaign trail, candidates make all kinds of promises. Once elected, they usually fulfill some of those promises. Others they may try to fulfill, but can't. Then, there are usually several promises they don't even try to fulfill. You borrowed $40 from a friend last week and agreed to pay him back today. But you then forgot all about it. This afternoon, your friend asked you for this money. You realized that you forgot, and you also discovered that you didn't have enough money to pay him. You asked if you could pay him back tomorrow instead, and he said yes. You just bought a car, and the salesperson said she'd have it ready for you the next day at noon. You arrived a little before noon and found the salesperson. She said that the car was all ready for you except that it was just going through the complimentary car wash. She disappeared, and at 5 minutes after noon, she brought the car right to where you were standing and handed you the keys. James and Eileen were deeply in love. He proposed to her, and 9 months later they married. Both their vows and their wedding dance song had the phrase, "Our love is forever, and after the end of time." Things started out pretty well, and both were very pleased when James landed a great new job. His immediate supervisor, Amber, who was also married, was strikingly beautiful, charming, and quite smart. After working closely together for a couple of years, James and Amber began an affair. James still cared for Eileen, and in fact their first child was just 9 months old. But James was wildly infatuated with Amber. A few months later, James and Amber both filed for divorces, and 6 months after that, they got married. James left the child with Eileen. How often do you make promises? Let's think about a few typical promises. I'll be there. I promise to get that done by noon. I pledge allegiance. By signing this contract, I agree. I take this man to be my husband. We make promises to others, and others make promises to us. Promises are so much a part of our lives that we seldom notice how much we depend on them. Of course, contracts still get broken, marriages fall apart, and commitments are not always kept. Yet we keep making promises because the practice of promising remains fairly dependable. If more promises and commitments were kept, the world would be a much better place. But, even as things stand, we all seem better off with promises existing than we would be without them. What would a world without promises be like? Business deals would be extremely difficult and uncertain. Financial exchanges would require immediate payment. Treaties would not exist or could not be depended on, and friendships and marriages would be crippled. Without the practice of promising, our world would be unfriendly, untrusting, and unstable. Widespread social rules and practices like promising generate consequences in the same way that individual acts do. In particular, promising generates much more utility for us than if it didn't exist. This, and other social practices, like respecting individual rights and enforcing justice, all promote overall utility. These observations lead us to a different consequentialist theory, called rule utilitarianism. Many people give up on act utilitarianism because of its difficulties. However, it's possible to reject act utilitarianism without abandoning all of that utilitarianism stands for. Rule utilitarianism gives us a way to do this. Like act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism maintains that positive consequences, or utility, determine what's morally right. However, it doesn't consider the utility resulting from individual acts, but from generally followed rules and practices. So rule utilitarianism has two fundamental principles. The principles of rules, which states A morally right rule or practice is one that would promote significantly greater overall utility if widely followed than if it did not exist. And the principle of acts. A morally right act is one that follows a morally right rule or practice. Rules identified as morally right by the principle of rules should be followed except when they come into direct conflict with each other. While act and rule utilitarianism agree that morality ought to promote overall utility, their crucial difference is that rule utilitarianism assesses the effects of general rules and practices, not specific acts. Put another way, rule utilitarianism tells us what kind of actions, for example, keeping one's promises, are morally right. Furthermore, it says that the morally right thing to do is usually to follow such rules regardless of the specific situation. This also contrasts with act utilitarianism, which says that right acts depend on the details of each particular situation. These seemingly small changes lead to important differences in the act and rule utilitarianism judges to be morally right. For instance, act utilitarianism must approve of promise breaking when that would best promote overall utility. But suppose that the principle of rules supports the rule, one should always keep one's promises. By the principle of acts, then, I should not break a promise even in situations where act utilitarianism says that I should. Rule utilitarianism shares most of the attractions of act utilitarianism. Like act utilitarianism, it is also objective, since it bases right rules, just as act utilitarianism bases right acts on objective empirical consequences. Rule utilitarianism is impartial, counting all individuals equally. And rule utilitarianism maintains an impressive simplicity. Rule utilitarianism also readily extends to include non-human animals. The one act utilitarian attraction not shared by rule utilitarianism is flexibility, an issue we'll take up in a moment. Rule utilitarianism also does better with the problems act utilitarianism struggles with. For instance, act utilitarianism often requires us to do difficult calculations to identify right acts. Act utilitarianism's solution to this problem is to rely on rules of thumb in place of precise calculations. But no rule of thumb can take into account all aspects of the different cases that fall under it. In fact, following a rule of thumb would sometimes lead us to obtain less utility than by doing what act utilitarianism itself defines as right. Rule utilitarianism also makes substantial headway against the cluster of problems involving promises, justice, and rights. These problems arise for act utilitarianism because it determines the moral right for each specific set of circumstances. It thus can end up allowing anything to count as a morally right act, as long as that act and those circumstances brings about the greatest overall utility. Promise breaking, assassination, torture, the mass killing of civilians, any of these can qualify as the morally right act under the right circumstances. Rule utilitarianism significantly sidesteps these sorts of problems thanks to its focus on the effects of general rules and practices rather than the effects of specific acts in specific circumstances. Once the theory determines the moral rightness of a given rule, that rule remains untouched by the varying influence of most special cases. For instance, we've seen that fulfilling the rules of promising remains a moral duty even when greater overall utility might be gained by breaking a promise. Furthermore, rule utilitarianism creates rules against lying, murder, and torture, which must likewise be followed regardless of the specific circumstances. Since the rules of rule utilitarianism do not apply case by case, the theory is able to rein in many of the cases in which act utilitarianism would tell us to do something that's clearly wrong. How does rule utilitarianism handle some of the act utilitarianism's worst problems with injustice and rights violations? Let's turn to the involuntary organ donation example that we saw in the previous chapter. Could rule utilitarianism support a rule that forces individuals to sacrifice their organs for the sake of meeting other people's needs? Act utilitarianism can allow forced organ donations in cases where the benefit to the many outweigh the losses for the one. But things change when we consider the consequences of an involuntary donation rule. Such a rule makes everyone a potential organ donor. At any moment, therefore, your health or even your life might be demanded of you. What would be living under such conditions be like? Arguably, everyone would live under a continual fear that this demand might suddenly be imposed upon them. This would also affect people's plans for their future. A woman wants to have a child or prepare for some profession, but she then realizes that her plans could be seriously thwarted if she's made an organ donor. Indeed, why would any of us invest in ourselves in any long-term commitments when such life-changing uncertainties are always looming over us? Given the disutility of widespread fear and difficulty of pursuing any long-term goals, it's not at all clear that rule utilitarianism could approve a forced organ donation rule. Rule utilitarianism can support many principles of justice and personal rights. It's beyond doubt that the most basic principles of fairness, justice, and rights extend equally to all would generate a tremendous amount of overall utility. Now, let's review. Rule utilitarianism has two fundamental principles. The principles of rules, which states that a morally right rule or practice is one that would promote significantly greater overall utility, if widely followed, than if it did not exist. And the principle of acts. A morally right act is one that follows a morally right rule or practice. Rules identified as morally right by the principle of rules should be followed except when they come into direct conflict with each other.